Now that we've talked about Spanish, I want to talk about English. And we looked at alveolar fricatives in Spanish. I want to continue our discussion from a previous class of alveolar stops in English. Here you can see we have the articulation. We have that alveolar ridge, that bump behind the teeth, and the tongue is pressed right up against it. It's a stop because no air can get out, right? So here it's our lungs, right? This is our stomach. We don't care about that. Air comes up from the stomach and it can't go out through the nose, right? So this isn't an N. It can't get out here through the mouth because the tongue is blocking it. This is a voiceless sound. You see this line here. So this is not maybe an L where it's sneaking around the sides. Right, I just said this. There's no vocal fold. There's no vibration in the vocal folds there. Now I've added the vibration in. And in that case, it could be L, but today we're just talking about the stops, so we're not talking about L. And we have all talked a lot in class, partly because of hurdles, about how T and D alternate. So T, we've talked about that quick puff of air that's called aspiration. It's written as a superscript H, but it's not a small puff of air. It's just a superscript because it's phonemically part of that T. It's nice to look at the word time because that's one of the few words along with Thomas where the H is actually written the way it's pronounced. Uh, and that's unlike D. When we say D, we go straight to the vowel. So the difference between dime and time is not necessarily the voicing, although that's how we talk about it. We say T is voiceless and D is voiced. Really, it's the fact that when you say a D, you go straight into the vowel dime. And if you know the way the T is pronounced in Spanish, French, and a lot of other languages, it's actually sort of like that. So I've talked about that word, I love you in French, je t'aime. That T goes straight into the vowel. It's not je t'aime, but je t'aime. And so that might sound like a D to you. So aspiration is actually how we express voicing in English. If there's And there are some cases where you can't aspirate, such as after S. So you think about a word like stop. When I demonstrated for you in last class about how we pronounce aspiration, I demonstrated with a piece of paper, and the word stop did not make the paper move. That's because we don't aspirate there. And you may have noticed if you're really curious about language, we don't have any words in English that start with SD. And the reason is because we couldn't tell the difference between them and a word that starts with ST because they would sound the same without that aspiration. And again, if you're curious, you may have noticed that we don't have any words that start with SB or SG because again, we couldn't tell them from aspirated stops in that voiceless stops in that same position. We're not going to talk about velar and labial stops for today, so I can move on from that. One more thing I need to talk about before we can get into the other alternation, although we've talked about it a little bit, is stress. Um, so one way, if you don't know how stress works in English, or you're not familiar with the term, one good way to look at it is words that are almost identical except for stress. So I'm going to give you some pairs of words, and on the left, you'll see nouns that have primary stress on the first syllable, and verbs have it on the second syllable. So if you think about how to pronounce these words, combat versus combat, uh, insert versus insert, object versus object, protest versus protest, you see that distinction between them. And it's sort of interesting. In English, we're sort of flexible. So we've got a new verb, protest. I'm sorry, that's spelled wrong there. That's not pretest, but protest. So let's make this an O for the record. Um, then we get a new verb, protest, which is to be involved in a protest, which is the noun form of protest. The first one I actually noticed when I was little was record versus record. And you can see again the aspiration occurs here in the stressed syllable, but not in the unstressed syllable. So some other interesting things going on there. Um, but if you don't know what stress is, you can think about pairs like this, where the stress shifts. So what is stress? The vowel is longer, right? I said we don't have long vowels in English. One reason we can't is because we use long vowels to show stress. It's also higher pitched. You can tell that when you are listening to music and they put the stress in the wrong place, it sounds wrong. And good songwriters know to put the stress syllable on the higher pitched syllables. Another way we know stress in English is because we have this reduction of vowels. So they get reduced to or I, right? Um, so if you look at these verbs, it's export, increase, insert, object, right? It's not object, it's object. It's just a schwa. And I say just a schwa because it's the minimal form of the vowel. In my dialect, actually, some of them can be I instead, so it can be insert instead of insert. If you don't hear the difference, that's because it's shorter, right? I said this unstressed vowel is shorter. Is one form of a uh, vowel that we do hear in unstressed syllables. It's when you have a schwa, but you have your tongue in the R position, and you can actually tell the difference between that and the syllabic liquid we looked at earlier. So when you see this symbol or this symbol, they have the same pronunciation. Okay, so now we know about stress, we can get more into this idea of flapping, which is something that I talked about in class previously. Um, So a typical T, that's a T pronounced with aspiration. We can hear that in these words, a test, until. So my H is appearing there. And they're not at the beginning of words. And I mentioned this in the previous slide. That's because these syllables are stressed. But we don't necessarily get that when the vowel after the T is unstressed. And we tend to hear a flap then. So here's a flap. Notice that my tongue is pointing directly up at my alveolar ridge. It's also voiced, unlike a T. So when you look at all these words, butter, later, bottom, little, waiting, promoting, pity, party, all of those have a voiced sound and might sound like a D to you, but I'm not saying butter, later, bottom, little, waiting, promoting, pity, party. I don't have D's. My tongue is pointing straight up, not like a stop. And it's very quick, this sound. And it is voiced, which also distinguishes it from a T. And all of those syllables, you notice, that have this flap, this thing that looks like an R without the serif, are unstressed. So again, I do want to compare those. Here's T and D. Your tongue is flat, pressed on the alveolar ridge. And you can picture if you had like some hot sauce up there, you really taste it if you pronounce the T or a D. But if you do a flap, you just might get a little tiny taste of it on the tip of your tongue, or maybe you don't even have enough taste buds there to know the difference. Uh, so it's important to consider this. A lot of times people associate a flap with a D because it's voiced and alveolar, but this pronunciation is quite different. And this is why other languages can use it like an R. So like the Spanish pero meaning but, or the Japanese arigato meaning thank you, both use this kind of R that we have in English as a pronunciation of T. This next part, I'm going to tell you something a little bit advanced. That's why this slide is light blue. This is nothing I expect you to learn in this class, but sort of peek ahead at some concepts you might learn in some more advanced classes. Um, so you might think about a pair like wedding, wetting, waiting, waiting, faded, faded. You might say they are pronounced differently. And I'm going to tell you one reason why people might say that. And that's because there's actually rule ordering in phonology. Nothing you'll ever have to worry about in an introduction to linguistics class. And in fact, when I taught phonology of Romance languages in the fall, we actually only did 2 assignments on rule ordering because There's so much to talk about with just phonological rules and features and all that. But let's look at our underlying phonemes here in step zero. You've got wait-ing and wade-ing. We really shouldn't pronounce things that are in sloshes, but just to give you a sense of what words we're talking about there. And then we're going to apply one rule. And this is a rule we haven't talked about yet. When you have a voiced consonant, the vowel before it will be longer. So this, again, what you learn in school about long I, short I, that is totally false. But one thing that is true in English is we have long vowels when we stress them, and we have long vowels when we have a voiced ending. So if you think about the difference between the word wait and wade, yeah, one ends with a T and one ends with a D, but it's hard to hear those because you're ending your word there. So one way in English we signal that is we give a longer vowel. This vowel is 3 times as long. So if you look at a recording of the word wait versus wade, the second recording will be 3 times as long. And that's what this thing that looks like a triangular colon is. It's saying that vowel is long. And of course, we talked about this. If you have a stressless syllable with a T in front of it, you will get a flap there. The rule is actually very complex for when we flap, but that's an approximation of how it works. Here I use the Spanish symbol for stress. There are different symbols for stress that we sometimes use. And then here's our fun pronunciation. So if you think you pronounce these differently, if you think waiting and wading have a different pronunciation, maybe that's because this is your rule ordering where you have voicing first. I don't actually have that rule ordering in my dialect of English, but I do have another one that I think is interesting. Um, So there's also vowel raising. So I mentioned this very briefly one time when we did a hurdle that I diphthongs are raised to oi before voiceless consonants in northern North American English. It's sometimes called Canadian raising, but it's actually very common pretty much everywhere, north of the Mason-Dixon line in the United States as well. And this is easier to hear for me. So let's look at the word write and ride. Now, write and ride sound different in my dialect. In some dialects, they might sound a little more similar. But one reason they sound different is because I raise the vowel when I say right. I don't say right. I say right with an I, right. And I say ride with the normal diphthong that's there. So because it's voiceless, I get a different diphthong. Now, when these we flap in the same thing here. We have an unstressed syllable. So that stress goes that not the stress goes away, sorry. The voicelessness goes away. A flap is voiced very briefly. And so the words writing and riding are pronounced differently. Why would writing and riding be pronounced differently when both the T and the D are pronounced the same? It's because of this rule ordering issue where this is pronounced I and then the environment goes away. Sort of like a solving a mystery. How did this happen? Ah, the environment changed. That crime scene got cleaned up, but there was still some evidence there of that T having been there previously. So if you like that sort of detective work or archaeology of words that's going on, you might be interested in an advanced phonology class. And of course, if you find even the basic stuff confusing and have no idea what's going on here, you won't have to worry about it in this class. Sorry about that. So again, we compare these sounds. If you're an English speaker and someone says a flap, you will hear a T. And of course, you're allowed to pronounce it that way too. So when it's totally fine, it's not unusual to say butter, bottom, little with T sounds. Of course, they're spelled with T sounds. Sometimes kids do spell them with D sounds, not necessarily because a flap is a D, but because you can't tell the difference between a T and a D in that position, as we saw with the connection between waiting and waiting with the T and a D. And we know these flaps come from alternation. Remember, alternation is important for allophony by looking at changes in words. So if you look at the word atom, atom is very usually pronounced with a flap, right? It sounds just like the name atom that's spelled with a D. But then you think about the word atomic, where the stress shifts because of the suffix put on there. You have to say atomic with a T. So if you can also see it with feudal. Feudal is nice because it has that one that's spelled with a D as well. So those two sound the same. But if you look at futility, futility does have a flap at the end, but this T has to be pronounced as a T. So we can't pronounce these with flaps. We can't say Adamic or futility. Those aren't available pronunciations for those words. That's why I've crossed them out. Another symbol we'll often use there is the asterisk symbol that comes before it to say it's ungrammatical, and you read about that. As I've been hinting at, D, of course, also flaps. It's just not really remarkable because D and the flap are both voiced. But you do get all of these pairs, some of which we've looked at already, where you can pronounce them differently, especially if you want to distinguish the two. But if you do not want to distinguish them, people mostly pronounce them the same. I remember the first time, for example, that I heard the phrase the latter, meaning this one, the second of two options. I thought the person was saying this one because I hadn't heard it before. And that's not sloppy pronunciation. That's not lazy pronunciation. That's just we mostly don't have need to distinguish those words. And also, people that say they always say T's might turn around and say a T the next time they're saying it. Obviously, all of these forms are distinct if you take off the suffixes, right? Fate and fade, we get a distinction, and possibly in the pronunciation of the ending, but as I mentioned, the length of the vowel. Sorry. So we've looked at a couple different pronunciations of T, the unaspirated, the aspirated, and the flapped one. We did not in this slide, so we also talked about the ch pronunciation. We get in try and tree. But one we haven't talked about is before syllabic N. So we did look at a lot of syllabic consonants, butter, little, and bottom or bottom. Um, I'm not sure how often this one is actually pronounced with a syllabic M, bottom versus bottom. If those sound the same to you, there may not be a difference. Other examples without syllabic consonants, party, tidy, coded, computed, waiting, writing. But one we didn't look at was syllabic N. And we do hear syllabic N in a lot of words. Happen, ribbon, often, or I know today a lot of people say often, including both my children. Given, basin, risen, chicken, wagon. But we didn't look at syllabic N after T. We talked about it briefly in class. Um, what happens when the sound preceding the syllabic N is a T? Then we get the glottal stop pronunciation. So these are pronounced button, mitten, cotton, flatten, satin, enlighten, frighten. Again, this is not a lazy pronunciation. If you're using your glottis, that's actually much further away from everything from your tongue than where you're going to say your N. It'd be much easier to say button with a T. But because that's hard to understand, we move that stop to another place. So don't make the mistake of saying this is a lazy or bad pronunciation. And it's usual for a lot of people to use it. Maybe you never use it, right? Maybe you always say button, mitten, cotton, flatten, satin, enlighten, frighten. You might be surprised though. You might be surprised to find if you heard a recording of yourself that you do say unbutton or this is made of cotton when you were speaking in a sentence. But what I don't hear, and sometimes students tell me they hear this sometimes. I haven't like heard it on a TV show or anything, and believe me, I'm listening for it, is to use a flap here. So button, midden, cotton, flatten, sadden, enlighten, frighten. I think one time I did hear someone say unbutton for the verb form, but that was just once. It might have been a production error, right? We talked about how there's no competence errors, but sometimes there's production errors. So don't use a flap before a syllabic N or a schwa N or an AN. Always use a gall stop or a T if you insist. So the articulation of this sound is not at the alveolar ridge at all. It is deep in the voice box, or deep down the throat, right in the middle of the voice box. So we've talked about voicing in the voice box. So here we have the uh picture like a camera down someone's throat. There are lots of pictures of this, by the way. I think those pictures are gross. They give me the heebie-jeebies, so I purposely drew these pictures so we didn't have to look at those. But if you think that sounds cool, feel free to look up pictures of cameras showing these sounds. So this is voicing. So the glottis is thin, so these two vocal folds, one, two, are close together, but they are loose, right? You picture when things vibrate when they are loose, right? You picture a violin string. If you pulled it really tight and you plucked it, it would make no noise. If you held your flute in a vise and tried to play it, it wouldn't make any noise. Things need to vibrate to make noise. Um, and so this is then you get voicing. And so any voiced sound is going to look like that. Your vocal folds are almost together. If you're breathing, if you're making a voiceless sound, you're going to have your glottis open like this. So this red area is, down toward the lungs, and the white parts are the muscles. Here you're making an H, and of course this is also exactly what you do for a aspirated stop. And the glottis is thin here, the glottis being the area between the vocal folds. But it's tight here to make an H. So the difference between and is how tight you're holding those vocal folds. And of course, one thing we haven't looked at here is when the glottis is completely shut, and that's when you get a glottal stop. So when you say button or look at that, when the sound at the end of that is a glottal stop. Um, we know stress, sorry, we know this is only for unstressed syllables because if you look at any combination of vowels before an N, you always get that typical pronunciation of T. So baton, attain, platoon, plantain, pretend, rattan, atone. There's a list of words with all sorts of different vowels. And because stress is a factor here, we can't have glottal stops or flaps here. These words should sound all wrong when I say them this way. So remember, button and button are two pronunciations of the same word, right? But baton and ba'an and badon, those are ba'an and badon are not possible words of English. Attain is fine, but ain and adain, no good. Platoon is great. Platoon and platoon, no good. So I hope this shows you that stress has to be a factor because all of these sound so ridiculous, whereas button and button, mountain and mountain sound like two pronunciations of the same word. So the last thing I want to look at before we get to another video that's gonna bring this lesson to a close is this sort of flowchart version of pronunciation of T. Um, I call them robots as in the, algorithmic sense of robot. So first thing you do is you say, is the next syllable an unstressed vowel followed by N? So n or in or un. If it is, then your T is going to be pronounced like a glottal stop. And if not, you ask yourself a second question, right? This is about that rule ordering I was talking about. Is the next syllable a different unstressed syllable? Some that you can get are and ol and if yes, you're going to get a flap, and if no, you're going to get one of the other pronunciations of T. If this were a long slide instead of a wide slide, we could look at how we get t and tr. Remember, we get tr in try and tree, or just unaspirated. Okay, so there's just one more video You need to finish this lesson.